this Jabber channel?
Should be. And no, it doesn't look like it's getting the top end devs channel.
Jack, if you're on X, you may want to retweet it as well.
Yeah,
I'm
waiting
streaming
for
it.
the waiting for the tweet.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, it looks like we're live. Went out 34 seconds ago.
I'll refresh.
It says learn about performance panel in Chrome DevTools with from Jack Franklin. Here, I can put the tweet in, or the.
I don't see that tweet yet. That's weird. I'm not seeing that tweet.
Yeah, me neither. I wonder if it's cached.
Copy link. There we go. How about that?
Let's see if I see it. Okay, I'll retweet that.
We have 9 people watching so far. So,
Jack, what's your handle on X?
It's Jack_Franklin.
Okay, got it.
yeah, I'll retweet it on my account as well here. My mouse is not cooperating today.
Okay, retweeted.
Nice. I just need to log in on my work machine to Twitter.
All
And of course, I don't know my password.
right.
How's it going, Chuck?
Pretty good. Just doing all the things, all the dad things and all the political things and all the personal things. And yeah, it's that season.
I'm mostly acclimating to my new job.
How's that going?
It's going fine. I'm enjoying myself. It seems to be a really good place so far.
Yep.
It's what I wanted to do, the position I wanted to have. Hopefully, I'll be able to, bring them value.
Yep. Oh, hang on. Since we haven't started, I'm going to get one of my kids to refill my water here.
Hey, can I have somebody refill my water, please? So you're saying that you're the only one from your team at that area?
Yeah, the only one in London. The rest are in. There's a lot in Munich, in Germany, and then also various places across the states, like Mountain View, New York, Seattle, somewhere else. Where have I forgotten? Don't know. A bunch of US offices, then London and Munich mostly.
Cool. All right. Are we ready to go?
Yep, I think we are.
Yep.
All right. And we're mostly going to focus on the tools, not necessarily like, here's how you performance your app, right?
Yeah, I think we've done a lot of episodes on that. Obviously we can speak about how, how to debug Core Web Vitals, and then we might want to mention what Core Web Vitals are yet again.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I think we should cap it at that and focus mostly on the tooling.
Sounds good. All right. Well, I'm going to get us started then. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Dan Shapir.
Hello from a warm and sunny Tel Aviv.
I'm Charles Max Wood, and I ducked out a stand-up to come to this, so I'm excited. We have a special guest this week. That is Jack Franklin. And Jack, you're based out in the UK. You want to tell us a little about yourself?
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, my name's Jack. I work at Google on the Chrome DevTools, focusing on the performance tooling. Based just outside of London, where it is sadly not so sunny as it is for Dan. A little bit cooler here.
Yeah, we get that all the time. It'll be like, minus 80, 100 degrees here in Utah. And he's like, yeah, it's like 60 degrees. And it's like, okay, just go away and come back next spring.
Yeah, there's the downside to that, which is how hot it'll get around July and August. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it gets hot here, but it's a dry heat. Like I lived in Italy for 2 years, and boy, it gets muggy there. It's like, yeah, it's 100 degrees, but it's a completely different 100 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's dive in and talk about Chrome DevTools. Jack, before we get too far in, I just want to get a little bit of a story here. Like, how do you wind up being a Chrome DevTools person?
Yeah, a lot due to good timing, I think. So I've been working in the front end space for all my career, really, since leaving university. And then I've been at Google now just over 4 years. And it was sort of 4.5 years ago at a conference in the Netherlands. I did a talk on how at the company I was at before Google, we were using React and building components and kind of re-architecting our front end in sort of component-driven manner, talking about kind of design systems and reusability and all that kind of stuff. And someone sat in the audience happened to be working at Google on DevTools and had a space on their team looking to hire someone in the London office. And so he spoke to me afterwards, and I applied and kind of went through the interview process and all that stuff, and thankfully came out the other side intact and with a job offer. So that was that. And then, 4 years later, I'm still here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's been an interesting ride for sure.
So your background is all web tech, because, obviously when you think about somebody who's working effectively in the Chrome browser, you also think about, hey, that person needs to be coding in C++ or stuff like that.
Yeah, so I have a computer science degree, but after that, the majority of my experience has been front end. I've certainly never done any C or C++ or anything in that region. I was a Ruby developer for a while. I've kind of dabbled with various languages, but professionally, the majority of my time has been JavaScript, TypeScript, and various front-end tech. The thing with DevTools is that it's actually a web application itself. So the entire Chrome DevTools is built with HTML, CSS, and TypeScript, and it gets embedded into Chrome. So although I don't have the background to dive into the sort of Blink Chromium backend side, I'm very able to be very productive on the front end, and work on DevTools.
So when I was a new developer, my mentor basically, we would joke that we were going to write an application that it was code quality, not performance, but it was going to be a really simple app that you would submit your code and it would just come back and say, this code is terrible. Right? Because everybody's code is terrible. So how
isn't the correctness problem like an NP complete problem?
I don't know. But how do you write a performance tool that's useful and not just your performance is awful?
Yeah, that's the challenge. I think as well, a lot of performance is about contextualizing it. So, depending on the type of app you have or website and how it's used and the average user, what technology they use to access, the sort of what we mean by good or bad performance can vary a lot. So I think the constant challenge for us is trying to strike that balance.
Right.
And also I think that the balance we have is we hear the feedback all the time. If you load up, go to a big website and use the DevTools performance panel to, reload the page and record a trace, you get presented with this flame chart and this stuff, and there's just boxes and different colors everywhere, and there's various lines and markers and all sorts. And it is very overwhelming if you've never used the tool before. Even if you have used the tool before, it can be like, oh my goodness, where do I even begin to start with
right.
this? So yeah, that's kind of what you're alluding to is similar to the battle we have of, we want to show you all this information so you can debug and dive in and understand truly why your website is, let's say, loading slowly. But equally, we want to try and not overwhelm you with all this information up front. And that's kind of the never-ending tension that we have. And I don't think right now we've kind of struck the right balance, but it's something we're trying to resolve and work on.
Yeah, it's funny you said flame chart, and my brain immediately went to there's a fire here and there's a fire here. The fire there.
Well, in the case of DevTools, it's an upside down flame chart. The fire is burning downwards.
Right.
Yeah. So and other tools will show it the other way with the flipped. There's a lot of different ways you can slice the data, and I think one of the challenges as well is how do we get people to understand and interpret what we're showing them correctly,
right?
And that is never ending.
But before we dive into the details of this or that DevTools DevTools panel in general, I want to first of all point out what an amazing tool DevTools are, and that people today kind of take them for granted. We've actually had an episode about DevTools. It's more in general. I forget who came on the show to talk about this from somebody else from your team. We'll need to check afterwards and put in a link.
I think it was Mikhail Hablish, I think.
Yes, it was. Thank you for reminding me. I still remember the days, I'm old enough to remember when we didn't have such tooling, and, how we would debug things with alerts. And afterwards we got it for
desktop. Still do that. What are you talking about?
and how, well, at least now you can console log, which is at least a bit better. And then we got it for desktops, but initially didn't have it for mobile. And then we got the ability to actually do it on mobile. So I think to a great extent, the modern web as we know it today could not exist without DevTools. And of all the DevTools in all the browsers, I like Chrome DevTools, or Chromium DevTools, let's say, the most. So kudos for that. Also, the other thing I wanted to mention is that if we look at the panels in Chrome DevTools, like half of them, I think, have to do with performance in one way or another. Like the network tab, the performance tab, the performance info tab, the lighthouse tab, the memory tab, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, I have to say, just to add to this, initially when I got into and realized that there were DevTools in there, right? And I think the first ones I saw were on Firefox, right? And I was like, oh, this is handy, right? And so then I'm starting to use some of the same tools on Chrome once I start using Chrome. And then somebody showed me the network tab and my mind was blown, right? And then somebody showed me one of the other tabs, I don't remember, and it was like, whoa, this does so much more. And so I have to admit, I haven't really deeply used the performance tab, so I'm hoping you're going to tell me, you've been missing out, and here's what it does.
Hopefully, I think that the first developer tools I remember using were Firebug, I think it was called. I think it was an extension to Firefox, like a third-party thing.
You need to install it,
and the first time I think I was debugging some CSS issue, and the first time I realized that using Firebug I could adjust the CSS in the tool and have it real-time update was just incredible to me. And obviously the tools have come a long way since, but Firebug I'll always remember that whenever we talk about DevTools in any situation, I think.
Yep, had the neat little bug icon in the toolbar.
Yeah.
So you want to give us kind of the 10,000 foot view on the performance panel, and what I guess what I'm looking for is sort of how do you expect developers to use it, and also, well, let's just start there because I can't remember what the other piece was.
Sure. Yeah. So really, I think when we talk about performance, or when people think about web performance within the context of Chrome and Google and all of that, we're really talking about the core web vitals, which are these metrics that Google has that we think represent kind of better performing websites and that provide better experiences to users. So we expect most people using the performance panel would be debugging their core web vitals scores. two of the core web vitals broadly, in fact, one, sorry, LCP, which is largest contentful paint. We can dive as deep into what these mean or don't mean, but LCP really represents how quickly or not your page was loaded and visible to the user, and they could kind of read it and see kind of what the content is. And so that's really all about loading speed. What is delaying loading your website? And that's one thing that the performance panel is really good at. You record your website loading. It shows you screenshots of the process as various elements loaded and were rendered. It shows you the network requests, and it shows you all the JavaScript that was happening at the same time. So that becomes a very good way to see, oh, there's this bundle of JavaScript that was 5 megabytes in size that took 10 seconds to download. That I can see visually that stopped, my page rendering and showing. Then you also have CLS, which is layout shift. So that's content shifting around the page as it's loading in. The classic example here is like the user goes to click a button, and as they do it, another button loads in and they click the wrong button, which is incredibly frustrating.
So I've never had that happen to me before, and it didn't make me really, really angry either.
I've had it before, like a banner has popped in at the top. It's pushed the checkout button down by 50 pixels. It's very frustrating, especially on
it's the banners. It's mostly the banners.
Yeah, that's what we'll do it most of the time. But again, that's the kind of thing we'll show you. And you, again, using screenshots, you can see kind of before and after those and try and figure out what element was responsible for that and go from there. And the final web vital is called INP. It stands for Interaction to Next Paint. Broadly, it measures how responsive and interactive your page is. So when the user clicks on, let's say, a button, how long is it until the UI updates to show them that your app has dealt with that button click and is processing or has registered it or is doing whatever. Right. I'd say typically, because that's newer and debugging sort of interactions where users have to interact with your page is harder. Debugging loading speed is a bit easier because normally you can run the page load, you might change something locally, rerun it again, and you can kind of replicate that fairly straightforwardly. Interactions where you have to try and click a text box, type in at a certain time to hit some edge case which is causing slowness can be trickier. But those are kind of what when we think about what features we should be building and working on in the performance panel and what kind of user journeys we want to make easier, it's those web vitals that we're kind of motivated by, really.
Gotcha. So how does that actually show up in the panel, right?
Yeah, so the main panel is made up of a series of what we call tracks. And these are kind of horizontal rows that go all the way across the screen. These show specific categories of events or things that happen. So an obvious one is the network track. This will show you all the network requests that happened during that time frame. And it shows them as rectangles where these are representative of time. So the wider the rectangle, the longer that particular request took. That's slight simplification because there are additional bars on either end which represent different parts of the network request and its life cycle.
I wanted to you mentioned it. It's for those, it's kind of duplicate information with the network tab in the sense that you can, in both cases, you can see the rectangles, the kind of the waterfall that represents the network activities. If I'm just analyzing the network itself, and often that's where I start, then to be fair, I prefer doing that on the network tab initially, simply if for no other reason that it's much less busy. But like you mentioned, with the bars at the ends, once I start analyzing the overall activity of the page and start correlating the downloads with the JavaScript activity, because let's say a JavaScript is triggering a fetch request, and then when that fetch request finishes, then JavaScript is triggered again to process the results of that fetch request. So when I do that holistic analysis, that's where the performance panel really shines. And you might want to explain, either now or later, those lines at the end, because like you said, there's the actual bar itself that has like a lighter color and a darker color for the, but it also has the bars at the beginning, like the mustache, I think you call it, at the beginning and the end.
Yeah, we call them whiskers.
Whiskers, okay.
But yeah, same concept.
I love it.
and yeah, so I think you're right. If you're debugging purely network issues, the network panel, just real estate wise has more room because it's only showing you network things, whereas the performance panel, we have to get the network in alongside all the various other things that we show. And yeah, the key thing with the performance panel, I think, is what Dan is touching on, is that you've got all these tracks that have different types of information in, but crucially, they're all aligned based on timestamp. So you can look vertically down and see exactly what all of these different, what stuff was happening at this particular timestamp. So what network requests were happening. Then we jump to a track that shows a screenshot of your page at that given time. Okay, so this is what the page looked like. Then we jump to any layout shifts that happened at that time, and then it's main thread activity, which really is what heavy JavaScript was running. Let's say re-rendering, an Angular component or a React component or whatever else it may be. So where the performance panel, I think, its power comes from is at any point in time, you can see across a load of different categories what the browser was having to do to provide the user with your website or web application.
It's funny you're talking about all of this, and I can imagine why it's so hard for you to figure out how to give people a concise picture of the thing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. The performance panel is, I think, by far the busiest of all the panels, to the extent I think that you created the performance insights panel to provide a slightly less busy view, as it were. But on the other hand, once you grasp it and you master it, I think it really becomes a superpower. Like it definitely takes you to the next level in terms of your abilities to analyze and understand what the web page is doing.
Yeah, and so to touch on the performance insights panel, so this is a distinct panel from the performance panel, very confusingly named. I'll give you that one. We launched this, I think, last year. It's very much an experimental panel. The goal was to kind of explore how we could, without hiding away all this detail, which, as Dan said, once you kind of understand it and what it's representing is really powerful and really lets you dive deep. But for users maybe newer to the sort of this topic, is very overwhelming. So the performance insights panel was an experiment in how can we pull out what we call insights and try and guide the user to, hey, here's a problem that caused your page to load, in a way that didn't need them to dive into all the nitty-gritty detail. It was, I think, semi-successful. The feedback was at a good mix of, hey, this is really useful, this sort of high-level view, to, hey, this is cool, but because I want another level of detail, I will never use this. I will always use the performance panel. And long term, we didn't really ever want to maintain two distinct panels for the foreseeable future. So actually, the performance insights panel will eventually be removed. But what we learned from that in terms of insights will be coming into the performance panel. There's a blog post which we can link to, I guess, in the show notes, or I can put on chat where we kind of talk more about these plans. But yeah, we're trying to figure out a world where we can give people these useful kind of insights, like, hey, this particular network request was the source of a lot of problems for you in this page load, but also provide all the data so people like Dan can dive in and find exactly what they're looking for.
So first of all, it's news to me that performance insights is kind of a temporary thing. So thank you for highlighting this. And you know what you should do? The answer is AI. Add the chat.
Yeah, we're still figuring out exactly how AI slots into all this, but yeah.
Yeah, you're at Google, so I was going to say you hand it off to ChatGPT, but you hand it off to Gemini and say,
yeah,
here's the output. What do you make of this?
Yeah, something like that. It's so hard as well because I really learned this when I started working on building the performance panel and understanding behind the scenes, the thing that powers the performance panel in these flame charts are what are called trace events. And these are really just objects of data that Chrome emits during a page load.
Mm-hmm.
And you begin to see, okay, so every time I have this event, I'll always have this other event that is named like this. And you can try and build relationships between these events. But then you release this feature into the world and, 1,000 people use it across 1,000 different websites, and they just blow all your assumptions out the window because there's such a variety of technologies and approaches and all the rest of it. And so the challenge with any AI would be useful whilst not kind of pigeonholing, I think, into a few certain categories. But yeah, who knows? I'm sure it'll be a space we'll be exploring along with the rest of the internet at some point.
So going back to the details of the performance panel, I think one of the things that confuses people the most about it is the fact that it simultaneously shows two timelines. That at the very top, you have a timeline that encompasses the entirety of the recorded period, while slightly below it, you have like a partial timeline.
Yeah, so we have the mini map, I would call it, at the top, which shows sort of the activity over the whole trace period. But then what we let people do is there's two kind of handles which you can drag to select a subset. And then the rest of the panel is scoped to that subset. The idea being that you can quickly zoom in on a period of time that is particularly interesting to you. That's one of the things we shipped, I lose track of time, earlier this year, is the ability to, once you've zoomed in, you can now actually click a button and kind of zoom in again and save that zoomed in state. But one of the things we're thinking about, it was something we wanted to do with the Performance Insights panel, didn't ever get around to it, was could we, for example, automatically detect areas of interest and provide you with shortcuts to jump to particular time spans that we think contain the most relevant information. So if you've got a page that takes 5-6 seconds to load, clearly that's not good and you'd like to get that down. But normally there'll be 3 or 4 culprits within that 6 seconds where your attention is best focused.
Well, you do kind of do it already, don't you? I mean, already when you record the page load, you often like zoom into a particular period of interest initially.
We will, but that's not because we've identified that period as interesting. It's because we've identified the rest of the trace as effectively dead space. So this is the example here is, say you record for 10 seconds and all the activity happens in the first 3 seconds. We'll try and zoom into those 3 seconds. So really, we're just trying to trim if there's dead space at the start or end of your timeline. We're trying to get rid of that. We're not really identifying like this is where there was a slow network request, and so we should draw the user's attention to that. That's kind of something I think on our radar to explore that idea generally of can we highlight areas of interest. And it's something that in Lighthouse, if you do a Lighthouse report on a page, will also show you estimated savings for a bunch of the audits. So Lighthouse will say, this image that you loaded was X megabyte big. If you convert it to whatever and optimize it, you might save 1 second on this network request. And so what we could do is we could begin to rank things we find based on how much potential savings we think there might be to help the developer prioritize as well. Because I think in a perfect world, developers would have endless amounts of time to spend optimizing every millisecond of their page load. But we all know that's not true. And sometimes this work is prioritized against other work and you don't get to spend as much time as you'd like on it. So can we direct you to the most impactful things sooner, so that if you only have a few hours or a day to work on this thing for your company, you can have the most impact.
By the way, you kind of mentioned here how you can maybe cross-pollinate between Lighthouse and the DevTools by bringing Lighthouse insights into the performance panel. I would like to mention that one cool feature of the Lighthouse that is built into DevTools is that you can jump from Lighthouse into the performance panel for that Lighthouse session.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you can click a link and it will take you into the performance panel with the recording of the page load that Lighthouse used. So you can dive in. And it's actually something we're working on, and this is in our blog post from earlier this year, is we are literally working on integrating Lighthouse's kind of analysis tools deeply into the performance panel. So the long-term vision is that there won't be a distinct Lighthouse panel within DevTools. We were not because we're removing that functionality, but it will kind of be combined into the performance panel. The exact details obviously to be ironed out, and there'll be a lot of experimentation on how we do this. But that is something that we're kind of working on. And just to be very explicit, that isn't Lighthouse going away. It's meaning, so if you want to work on performance in DevTools, you go to the performance panel, and you don't have to decide between the performance panel or the performance insights panel or the Lighthouse panel. We're trying to kind of collate the best of everything into one panel, like that is the place to go.
So when we record a session within the performance panel, the obvious way is to simply just click the record button, which starts a recording, and then you can do whatever you want, including reloading the page, and then you explicitly stop the recording when you want. The other option is to click the reload button, which automatically instigates a reload of the page with the recording enabled, and then also automatically stops the recording when loading is complete. How do you determine when to stop the loading, by the way, in that scenario?
Oh, you're pushing my memory of the code, but I'm pretty sure it's after a particular event, like a particular page load event. I think we wait a few more seconds, I think, but I'd have to look up the exact implementation, but I think it's something fairly straightforward, like wait for this particular event and then allow a few seconds of grace for anything else to flow in. But yeah, the idea with that one is we expect people to use that when they're explicitly debugging their page's load time. So we wait for when the event that basically tells us that the page is loaded, give a few extra seconds just in case, and then stop, if I remember rightly. But don't quote me on that.
So usually when I'm loading a page, in some cases, let's put it differently. When it works, I like to use the reload button simply because it's the faster option. I have run into some cases with some websites where it stopped too soon. And then my only recourse was to actually click the record explicitly, reload explicitly, and then stop it explicitly when it's done. But yeah, when the reload works automatically, it's the cleaner, it's the nicer option. Now, as long as we're talking about that, though, another thing or another suggestion that I have, or a gotcha to watch out for, is a lot of people just analyze the loading performance in a regular tab in the regular browser, and that means that they're also kind of profiling all their extensions, which may not be what they want to do. So very often what you really want to do is to try to analyze it in the mid, at least to begin with, in the cleanest environment possible. And in that context, I wanted to ask you, because there are really two ways to achieve it. One way is to simply open up an incognito window and do the recording in that. Another option is to create a profile just for debugging purposes. So basically just create a local profile, has no extensions in it, and use that. Which would you recommend?
I don't think it makes too much difference. I think I'm trying to remember if people would have to think about caching if they had a distinct profile, because also often you want to make sure in DevTools that in the network panel you've deselected or ticked rather disable cache in order to get kind of a fresh page load. So I'm trying to remember if incognito effectively, but it wouldn't matter if you tested the same website a few times in the same incognito tab. So I think it's really a matter of personal preference. But yeah, that is a common kind of gotcha, that when you're reloading the page, you are reloading the page within your active Chrome profile, and we can't do anything to stop all those various extensions and whatnot running. So yeah, we do recommend one of those approaches, ideally for traces, if you're trying to be the most accurate. I think another kind of on that same theme, we see people testing a lot on their very fast Ethernet connection in their office in the center of some big city, which has amazing connection speeds. Generally, I think people need to consider if they should be throttling the network, which is something you can do from within the panel before you start a recording, to try and emulate, say, a 3G connection or something slower if your users maybe are typically on mobile a bit more, or if generally your users just aren't on a big Ethernet connection.
So one other thing with mobile is, and I think I've seen people do this, but I'm not sure exactly how. And I guess this is more a general DevTools question than a performance question. But if I load the app on my phone, sometimes it does things a little differently anyway. Yeah. And so is there a way to hook up my DevTools on my computer so that I can watch the performance on my phone?
Yeah, there is. So you would plug in your phone via a USB lead, and then there is there's DevTools remote debugging. I don't quite remember the steps to get it
Okay.
working, but there'll be documentation. But yeah, that isn't an explicitly supported use case. So you can do it, I think.
Yes, you definitely can. There's just one really important caveat, which goes to the episode we recently recorded with Bruce Lawson. And that's the fact that Chrome on iPhone is not Chrome.
Hmm.
So if you want to debug Chrome on a mobile device, you can debug Chrome on an Android device. But if you want to debug Chrome on an iPhone, that's kind of a problem because it's not really Chrome.
Yeah, well, that's just another reason, since it's a different engine and everything, right? Because it's all using the WebKit engine.
Exactly.
Yeah. Then I definitely want to be checking it out, right? Because it may do something entirely, completely different, or do it in a different way.
It will, but the problem is that I don't think you can use Chrome DevTools to debug Safari.
Right.
And Chrome on iPhone is effectively Safari.
Yeah.
So, until we finally get Chrome on an iPhone, fingers crossed. It's so for now, if you really want to do the mobile debugging rather than simulating a mobile device, you really have to use an Android device.
Yeah, correct.
Now, so we talked about the tracks, the structure of the panel that at the top you have, you called it the mini view. How did you call it?
The mini map.
The mini map, and it's really a useful starting point, and you've added a lot of useful information into it. So you've got the screenshots. You've got the graph showing periods of CPU activity and even color-coded to show what the CPU is busy doing. I not so long ago learned that when it's thatched, it means that its activity, the CPU is busy, but it's off of the main thread. Is that correct?
I honestly couldn't tell you off the top of my head without checking. So there are kind of, is this like the horizontal bars that appear, or is this kind of thatched in the sort of?
I'm talking about the graph at the very top of the mini map. Yeah. Where you see the yellow graph for the JavaScript, for example, and occasionally you would see like a thatched pattern. And you also have those small bars that are either dark red or light red to indicate long tasks, as I recall.
Yeah, so they indicate long tasks. I don't remember the exact heuristic for why areas are thatched, but yeah, it will be something problematic. But I don't remember the exact criteria for what it is off the top of my head. But I will dig it out later on.
By the way, long tasks or long frames, sometimes they're called, are basically, again, correct me if I'm wrong, are basically when the main thread is busy and consequently is unable to produce the desired frame rate. In other words, it's jank.
Yeah, exactly that. So the browser wants to create a frame, but it's not able to. It's not. Here, create a frame basically means paint an update to the user, update the website, but it's unable to because JavaScript is keeping the main thread busy, and therefore browser doesn't get a chance to do it. So the best way to kind of deal with that is ideally split up your JavaScript into smaller tasks. There are now APIs. I don't remember the stage they're at, but they're coming around scheduling. So there will be a scheduler API where you'll be able to enqueue some code like a callback function to run, but tell the browser what priority that callback function should have. So there's more powerful scheduling tools coming to the browser. They may already be in there. I don't quite remember. But the way other people do this is you can use the request animation frame callback. Historically, I think people use set timeout and gave it a function and then with a 0 time, which really just gives the browser, a chance, a gap to do some other work. So that's the main thing that is important with long tasks. Is it's too much JavaScript running without a break.
Yeah, I'm kind of amused by that because, we talk about ways to do splitting on idle callbacks, set timeout, like you mentioned, and other APIs that are coming. But realistically, I think, unfortunately, a lot of web devs are not really using these APIs directly anymore because we're working primarily inside frameworks like React or Vue or Angular, and they control when our code runs, and how execution is partitioned. So, for example, in if you're using React, it's probably about using suspense and use transition and stuff like that, rather than manually scheduling code in most cases. I mean, obviously there are other different scenarios, but that's for better or for worse, for what I'm seeing, that's the reality. And more often than not, like a long period, for example, when using React, a long task would be the hydration. And a lot of developers aren't really sure what they can do about it anyway. So it's like leaving it up to the framework to resolve such issues.
Yeah,
this reminds me of trying to get my sister off the phone when I was a teenager.
Yeah, I think some of those APIs, I think some of the motivation is that they will be able to be used by frameworks. So I think some of the APIs around scheduling in particular, I mean, I wasn't involved in the design process of them at all, but it is thinking about how can developers use this to break up their JavaScript, but it's also thinking about how can framework authors use this to very easily introduce kind of batched or scheduling or scheduled updates using what's built into the web platform and the browser, which has a couple of benefits, really. Firstly, it should be more accurate and bluntly better implemented, unless you spend a lot of time working on scheduled kind of updates. They can be very fiddly. And it also means that those framework authors don't have to write code themselves to manage the scheduling and batching, or at least they have to write less because they can also lean on a kind of built-in browser API. So some of the work in these APIs is not necessarily aimed at developers building websites. It's aimed at those building the abstractions that a lot of people are building on top of.
So you mentioned what is probably the most colorful part of the performance panel, which is the flame chart. Obviously it's kind of difficult to explain without showing, but can you briefly describe what it is and how you read it, as it were?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. This really is a picture paints 1,000 words, but I'll try and say fewer than 1,000 words. So the flame chart represents activity that was happening in your page. We're talking here JavaScript that ran. And the way to look at it is, a rectangle on the flame chart was a bit of code that ran for a certain period of time, represented by how long or short or wide, I should say, the rectangle is. But what people will also see is there's nesting within the flame chart. So when you look at it, it almost looks like a tree structure. So you can see that there are rectangles, and then below that rectangle, there will be a smaller rectangle. And then below that, there could be many levels of these sort of nested rectangles. But if you look at the rectangle at the top and then go down the flame chart, all the rectangles below the first one will be smaller or contained within its parent. So you can think of this as a tree or a parent with a child, and that child might have more children. And so what this lets you do is it lets you look at the top row, which might say long task, and it might say it was a second long. Then as you take that and you look vertically down the flame chart, you're going to see all the functions and code that ran within that long task that added up to make its total duration. The reason this is so helpful is you might have a long task that's a second long. If you look one level deeper at its children, you might see that one of its children took 0.01 of a second. So that's really not useful. The other child took, 0.999 of the second. And so what that lets you do is it lets you see, okay, there was a long task. You can look down to see the culprits or the causes of that long task and really dive in to the weeds of it.
And just to add, and potentially it helps clarify, think about a function A that calls function B twice. So you'll have a wider rectangle for A, and contained with it one level down would be two rectangles for the consecutive rectangles for the separate calls to B. And in this context, it's useful to remember that JavaScript is essentially a single-threaded language. We have workers, but they effectively run independently of each other. So it's always contained within, as it were.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and that, long tasks can be caused by one of two things broadly: either one function that took an absolute age to run, or one function that doesn't take very long to run but got called, a million times. And so the flame chart lets you figure out which one of those two it was. Because obviously the resolution or the way you fix that is different. Generally it all boils down to, can we do less work? Can we run less lines of code? But sometimes it can also be highlighting where you might have a function that you think you don't need to optimize because it isn't very complicated, but if it's being called loads and loads of times, then it may well need to be have a bit more attention given to it.
Now, it's called a flame chart, I guess, because of the shape, but it's also called a flame chart, I think, because of the colors, which are often yellow, red, purplish, etc.
Yeah.
That color coding, how does it work? What's kind of the logic behind which color each rectangle gets?
Dan, you're really pushing my memory of all these details.
That's what I'm here for.
So yeah, yellow, if I remember rightly, is scripting most of the time. The ones that are particularly interesting is purple is like browser layout type events. This might be a recalculate styles event, which is where something happened which made the browser have to do a bunch of work to check that its latest layout of the page is accurate. The kind of most common gotcha with those is if you call a method like get bounding client rect on an element, or if you read an element's, Paul Irish has got a great GitHub page with all the different ways you can trigger this. But if you read an element's width or height or scroll top and various things, the browser, before it gives you that value back, has to make sure that what it thinks the layout is what the layout is. So it will do some extra work to kind of verify that. And so what you want to do is minimize how often that happens, because that can be quite expensive on a complicated page. So that's purple.
I'd like to tell a short story about that. So a while back, a friend of mine contacted me about a problem that they were having with an application. It happened to be written in Angular, but it's neither here nor there in that regard, which was taking a very long time to render its primary view. And when I talked to them and we looked at the flame chart, it became pretty obvious that it was laying out a whole lot of time. Effectively, it had layout thrashing. And because the way that this application, the UI was structured, it was structured as a lot of rectangles. And they built those rectangles in a way that certain amount of text and images needed to fit nicely within them. And now, instead of using CSS to kind of properly factor those sizes, they actually initially used JavaScript for it. So they would, put the content in a rectangle, get the dimensions for the rectangle, fix the content, and then do it for the next rectangle, then do it for the next rectangle. So effectively, each rectangle required a relayout. So they were changing some position and width aspects, and then querying the width and height aspects. So for every rectangle, a relayout, and there were hundreds of such rectangles on the page, and that's what's known as layout thrashing, when you're forcing the browser to relay out multiple times in order just to render that initial one view. And basically what I told them is one of two things: that the less ideal solution would be to have, instead of one loop, putting in the content, then getting the layout information, putting in more content, getting layout information, do it as two separate loops, or even three loops. Do all the positioning, get all the layouts, and then do all the fixes. And that actually turns out to be faster, even though it's potentially counterintuitive, because the browser can do just the one layout instead of the layout thrashing I just described. Or even better, just do it in CSS. Let the CSS do it for you, and then you don't need to do all those layouting at all. And that's what they ended up doing. And it became from like a 30-second load to being literally like a second. So it was like a huge win in terms of performance, and that's definitely something that you can see in DevTools. And I think these time now you can even see it better, because I think you even provide some attribution to the relayouts that occur.
Yeah, we can't detect every single instance, but if we can, we will draw arrows in the flame chart, which will take you from one event that caused another event. So we can often attribute why a layout happened. Or similarly, say you run code that has a set timeout in. When the function within the set timeout gets called and you find that on the flame chart, we'll draw an arrow back to the code that ran the set timeout, so you can see kind of why things happened. I think there's a lot more we could do there, but yeah, we do try and draw the arrows to give you some idea if you can. But yeah, I mean, a big theme when you look at the main flame chart and you see lots of stuff going on is to ask, firstly, I've talked about, can you spot functions that you can optimize or reduce how long they take to run? But it's also, do you even need to run that code at all? And I think, Dan, there are plenty of cases like the one you just described where actually, especially now, if you're targeting modern browsers, CSS has got a lot more powerful, particularly around layout. And I think there are a lot of cases where you can actually get rid of JavaScript and lean on CSS a bunch more. Like, if you can optimize a function, great. If you don't ever need to run it, that's even better.
I'm kind of curious as people come into this and they start, because we've kind of talked about some of the specific things that are in the performance tools, but I'm kind of thinking through my head, okay, what's the scenario, right, where somebody's gonna, and maybe people are regularly checking this as they build their apps. But I'm also thinking, maybe somebody is looking at things and realizes that they have poor scoring on some of their core web vitals, right? So what scenarios are you looking at? Is it one of those? Is it something else where you're finding that people are typically reaching for this particular panel in the Chrome DevTools? And then how do you pull the information out and know what to do with it? Because it's one thing to say, okay, all this information is in there, and I think we've covered a lot of that. But okay, I've got this information now. How do I know that it's layout thrashing, or how do I know that it's something else, or maybe it's something really simple and it's just I load in an image and my whole page shifts and it takes a long time for it to grab it and pull it out. So it's impacting 2 or 3 scores.
Yeah, so I think most common use case is people who run their website through a Lighthouse report and see that something is scoring badly, or it will be people who are getting reports from their users that their website is loading slowly. That was often the motivation at my previous job. Was it would normally be a member of staff was on a really rubbish connection and would moan that the site loaded very poorly. Okay. So I think that's mostly how we expect people to come into the tool is some issue. And obviously Core Web Vitals can impact search rankings. That tends to be the motivating factor for the majority of businesses who want to invest in this area. Yeah, in terms of understanding the information, that's really what the experimental performance insights panel, that was one of the goals of that. So when you use that panel, you get a right-hand sidebar that shows, I think we call them insights, and it will highlight things that were particularly problematic. Now, we didn't do a good job of prioritizing those and helping people understand which ones were most important. And that's something we need to improve as we kind of bring that functionality into the performance panel. But it would highlight problems. So, for example, a network request that is render blocking, as in until the browser is finished with that request, it can't continue laying out the page. Mm-hmm. We would highlight that as an issue, because if you can resolve that, the browser can get rendering earlier, and therefore your page will appear loaded to the user much more quickly. So I think really a theme for us this year is trying to have actionable kind of insights that we can provide people to give them a helping hand to figure out what was going on.
I think a key aspect, and probably the biggest challenge around improving performance, is attribution. Understanding the root cause for why something behaves the way that it does. Like, okay, this page is loading, or this block, the page is unresponsive. Why is it unresponsive? What's actually running that's causing it to be unresponsive? What is the browser actually doing?
Jokes. That's why.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and it's a challenge. It's not easy to figure out the attribution. I'm on the the W3C Web Performance Working Group, and a lot of the discussions are about how to try to figure out like the reasons the browser does what it does, and then externalize this information, and also how to do it in a way that in itself is performant and also doesn't become a security or privacy issue. So there's a lot of problems around that. But part of it is that the browser is a sophisticated system, and consequently understanding attribution is not a trivial problem. You need to have a certain amount of understanding of how this thing works. So there you can make it just so simple, but probably not simpler. Now, as you might expect, I also have the performance panel open while we're talking, and I just noticed something that I've never seen before. So I'm going to take the opportunity and ask you, Jack, about it now. I noticed that when I'm floating over the various the strips or the tracks, as you call them, they now show like this, like a pencil at the left side that I can click on, and then I get this weird view with eyes and check marks. What is that?
Yeah, so this UI will change in the next release of Chrome, which must be out very soon. But this was or is a UI to enable people to reorder and hide and show particular tracks. So when you record a performance trace, that you get a bunch of these tracks, and obviously that some of them are really, like network is obviously an important one. The main thread activity is important, but you will get others for, say, GPU activity, rasterization, any workers that were on the page, and so on and so forth. Depending on your use case, those may or may not be useful to you. And one of the challenges of the performance panel is embedded within DevTools, which not most people don't have DevTools open full screen because it's within Chrome. So vertical space tends to be at a bit of a premium for us. So this is kind of, we've been playing around with how could we enable people to hide and show information. But yeah, I'm not thrilled with the UI that landed will change. It was kind of a first pass at it, and we've tweaked a bunch of stuff for Chrome 1.26, which should be out soon.
So for example, if there's the animations track. So you're saying if I don't actually have animations on the page, or I'm not currently testing the performance of animations, maybe I'd like to hide it just to save, some vertical space.
Yeah. I think what we need to do is potentially, could we do some of that automatically for you? Because also right now, I think if you wanted to hide all the non-important tracks, you might have to click 10 or 15 of them to get rid of. So I wonder, there might be a world where we can invert that, and you can tell us the ones you want to keep around. I don't quite know, but yeah, what you're seeing is our sort of first steps into the water of allowing, I think, users to customize the timeline they see better to suit their particular use case. Because depending on the context that what the problem is you're trying to debug, there are certain things you may or may not care about, and we can't always know that for sure. That we're trying to get better at figuring out what you're trying to debug and show you the right level of information. But kind of going back to what you're talking about around attribution, yeah, that is the challenge. And what we're trying to figure out is there are some times where we can very confidently attribute a particular issue to a particular root cause. So, for example, layout shifts, a very common root cause of that is we load an image into the page, but the developer didn't set the width and height explicitly on the image. So the browser kind of guesses or reserves a certain amount of size. Then when the image loads in, it now knows the correct size for the image, and it resizes it down, which can cause the page to shift. So we can quite often very easily point to that. But other ones, we're sometimes sort of guessing. We're trying to figure out how we can say to users, this might be a problem that you should look at, but it also might not, because we can't be 100% sure. And that's a tougher kind of story to tell and guide people on.
Now, while we still have a bit of time left, so we were talking about the top part, which is the mini map. We were talking about the central part, which actually contains the flame chart. There's also a bottom part, which has the summary, bottom up, call tree, and event log. Can you briefly describe what that section is?
Yeah, I'll try. So the summary tries to show you, it will show you one or two things depending on what you've selected. If you've selected a time range in the panel, it will show you some stats about how much of that time range is spent doing various activities, how much was spent like the browser paints or rendering versus scripting, effectively your JavaScript or not. If you select an actual individual event, say a network request, it will show you some extra information about the particular event you've selected. Then the next three, bottom up, call tree, and event log, they're all based on trying to get a better understanding of the JavaScript and the flame chart. So bottom up, the idea there is you get a view of all the sort of events in the flame chart. You can filter them by name, and you can also sort them by how long they took and the duration that they took. The idea there being that it can sometimes be an easier way to dig into where your page spent most of its time executing. And call tree and event log are similar. Event log I never use and I don't remember. I think call tree is very similar to bottom up, but whereas bottom up starts literally from the bottom and goes upwards. So bottom up starts with the sort of leaf nodes of the tree. If you think of the flame chart, it starts with the things at the bottom that took the most time. I think call tree might go the other way, but
yes,
again, I'd have to double check.
Yes, it does. The main benefit of using these is that because you might say, why do I need this information? It's kind of a duplication of the information that I have in the flame chart itself. The main benefit, aside from filtering, which you mentioned, is the fact that it also aggregates. Because the example I gave before, where function A calls function B twice. So in the flame chart, you see each instant of the execution of function B separately. But in the bottom-up view, it starts from B and it aggregates all the time spent inside of B. So like you mentioned, that a certain function may have a significant impact on the execution, on the loading time of a page, might be because that function ran once but ran for a very long time, or maybe it ran really quickly but was invoked a million times. So in the aggregated view, in the case of that function being invoked a million times, will show the total amount of time that was spent inside that function in all those individual invocations.
Yes, thank you. That's a good additional point that I didn't.
I was looking at this too because it also shows. I opened it up and just ran it on StreamYard, which is what we're using to record this, and it also showed like the garbage collection and some of the other system calls as well as like paint and animation frame fired and things like that. And so it really does give you a drill down, right? If you're doing something that is heavily memory intensive and is going to trigger garbage collection on a regular basis, and maybe that's going to affect your performance one way or another, right? Because I would assume that most apps maybe don't have that problem, but I've seen people do some weird stuff on the web.
Yeah,
and so
we actually hit that problem.
This will give you all kinds of information.
Yeah, so because DevTools is a web app, we can debug DevTools using DevTools. Which means we can profile the performance panel's performance by using the performance panel in another DevTools to profile DevTools. Inception. It gets a little bit confusing, but the performance panel. So the main sort of UI, all these tracks, is drawn via an HTML canvas, and so that means every time the user scrolls or pans or zooms in or out, we have to redraw the whole canvas to represent what they've just done. And so that is a lot of function calls happening in a very short space of time to lay that all out. And we had a situation where we were passing to a function that got called, I think, for every single event on the timeline. So potentially hundreds of thousands of times, if not more. We called the function with an object, so we could destructure the arguments from that object. Now, every time you do that, that object that you pass in has to be garbage collected at the end of that function's lifecycle. Right. For 99% of the time, 99% of developers probably, that's never a problem at all. It's not a concern. Yeah. But when you call that function a million times in sort of a split second, that's suddenly a million objects that now had to be garbage collected. And so what we had to do was change that function. So rather than taking an object with, say, 5 different keys and values, we have to pass each of those individually as an argument to the function. So it sacrifices, in that case, a small amount of readability, but it it massively improved the performance. And you know, when you're talking about redrawing a canvas as the user is zooming or scrolling, you notice any slowdown in performance. So that's kind of, we have to be very hot on that sort of thing.
There's another lesson here, and that lesson is that the performance panel is an amazing profiling tool, and you should never start to optimize stuff, especially micro optimizations, before you profile and identify the problem areas. Because, you know, like you said, like Jack just said, like you said, Jack, you sacrifice a little bit of readability. Well, you shouldn't sacrifice readability unless it makes a measurable positive impact. You were able to prove that it does, and that it's worth that small amount of readability, you know, sacrifice in that particular case. And so yeah, that's a point that's really important to make in that context. By the way, another important point to make that's kind of related to what you said before that, Chuck, about whether or not that kind of activity is a problem in most web applications. You can also use all these tools, including the performance panel, to profile node-based applications. You can attach to Node and profile Node. And Node, let's say you've got a Node service that's long running, for example. Let's say it's not some sort of a Lambda or something. It's an actual long running Node process that's serving a ton of users. It can definitely have issues around memory allocations and stuff like that. So it's not just extreme client-side situations like the DevTools itself. It's, you know, it's your average node service that happens to be servicing, 10,000 users.
Yep, makes sense.
I actually used it specifically. I a couple of months ago, I made a contribution to the Prometheus client for Node around just that, identifying a problem, like it's kind of similar to what you described, Jack, of allocating a lot of objects and identifying that it could be done more efficiently. In that particular case, they were building a huge string by concatenating strings into it, which in most cases is fine, but in that case, it was literally millions of strings. So using a join instead turned out to be significantly more performant in that particular example.
Yeah, we've had loads of instances like this. There's a blog post on the Developer Tools blogs. We recently did a big a rewrite of sort of some of the internals of the performance panel, and then we were profiling it. And I think we have some test kind of traces that we can load into the performance panel that are absolutely massive, like far bigger than anyone's average website would generate. And for one of those, I think we were able to get the time the performance panel took to process and load that trace, I think down from something like 12 seconds to 2 seconds, just by recording with the performance panel and then going through and looking for these problem areas. But, you know, we couldn't have done that optimization without looking at the performance panel, because obviously we'd written all the code that caused it to be slow. And you wouldn't look at any of those changes and think, oh, that's going to be a problem here. That is going to be slow for us. Sometimes you can, but most of the time you do need to wait and actually profile it, you know. Like
never trust your intuition around performance.
No, it's always wrong. Yeah, it's always wrong. Yeah, and that passing objects into functions and rewriting those as arguments, we don't follow that everywhere in the panel, because it's only a problem in the code that redraws the canvas, because that is our real hot path, needs to be as optimized as we can, and we may have to sacrifice readability in order to do that. But in, say, the summary bit at the bottom that shows you information, that doesn't re-render every time the user scrolls. So in that panel, in that part of the code, we probably would still pass an object in, because we know that that's not going to be a path that's going to cause us problems. So yeah, the advice to always profile and not prematurely optimize is very accurate, because it will always surprise you. And browsers are smart. Sometimes they can optimize things that you might think would be slow because they recognize what you're doing. Sometimes something that intuitively you think won't be slow will be slow for some very niche reason. So yeah, it's very important and to use the tools available to figure that out before you go diving in.
So we're kind of at the end of our time. Are there places where people can go and dive deeper into this stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, the performance panel is very heavily documented in the DevTools documentation online. In terms of what we're sort of planning, there's some blog posts on the Chrome for Developers blog that have more information on this, which I can kind of send links to all the things that I think are useful. That's probably the best place to start. In terms of sort of keeping up to date with what's new in DevTools, I think following the Chrome developer YouTube account or Twitter and all that stuff is probably best. The Jesslyn, who's the DevTools DevRel, does regular videos. Mm-hmm. She's amazing. She does regular videos and will highlight new features across the panel, including in any of the performance tooling. So that's,
by the way, the what's new section, which is inside DevTools itself, it's in the drawer part, actually contains the video showing what's new for the latest version. And from there, you can get to the what's new for previous versions as well. So it's really worthwhile to review these videos. They're short, they're sweet, they're very informative, highly recommended.
Awesome.
Yeah, agreed.
There is one thing before we let you go, before we finish this episode. There's one request, which I think I submitted like years ago via your feature request mechanism. And that's the ability. So obviously, what you can already inside the performance panel have multiple recordings and like flip between them.
Yeah.
What I'm really missing is the ability to compare recordings. So for example, if I made a change and I think it seems to have impacted performance, I would love to have like subtract one view from the other and only see the differences. That would be awesome.
Yeah, you're not the first person to mention that. And it's certainly floating around the backlog. I think it's something it's hard because if you record if you have the same website and you recorded two traces without changing anything, due to the variability of the internet and computers and whatever else your computer was doing at the time, those traces are going to be slightly different. So I think the challenge there is figuring out how do we represent what changed and try to figure out what changed just because variability and what changed because you did something. So I think we can see the appeal and the reason it would be very useful. The practicalities of implementing it is potentially slightly challenging, along with how we manage the real estate on the screen. If you want to compare these two traces, the panel is already crammed full of stuff as it is. But it's floating around as an idea we want to explore for sure.
If it were easy, then everybody would be doing it.
Well, exactly.
I will mention that the awesome web page test now has an interesting ability to compare two recordings, which is also not perfect, but it is pretty good.
I was just going to say, if you estimate it in your estimation meetings as a medium, and then you come back after you start working at it and go, actually, this is an extra large, I didn't realize, then maybe we'll get it sooner.
In other words, lie.
I'll give it a go.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks and wrap this up. Now let's get the dad jokes going first. Steve, do you have some picks for us?
Well, I can look at that one of two ways. It's either let's hurry up and get them out of the way, or let's get to the best part.
I did not say that.
Or the best part first. So
I didn't say that either.
I'll cut you a little slack there on that one, Chuck. Jack, this is always the high point of any of our episodes, according to statistics and comment forms. But sorry, I got
damn lies and statistics.
Huh? Lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? Just a sec. I got to get my branding thing here. Okay. So the other day, my son, who's I won't say how old he is, he ate a bunch of coins. And so I had to take him to the ER. And after about an hour, I asked the doctor, I said, how's he doing? He said, no change yet. Almost repeat. There we go. Okay. So
it was just that funny.
I decided that I'm going to make some money off my dad jokes. since I've been doing it for free so long. I have to write them all every day. It's a lot of stress. So I'm going to put out a cologne for men who like dad jokes. I'm going to call it Pungent.
That's nice.
Right. Now this one requires a little bit of thinking, but I'm the dad jokes for the smart person. So my nerdy friend just got a PhD in the history of palindromes. Now, palindromes, for those who might know off the top of your head, there's words that are spelled forward and backwards. They're the same when you do them forward and backwards. Now we call him Dr. Awkward.
Yeah, you need to see it to get it, but it's great.
Right. Very good. So those are my dad jokes for the week.
All right, Dan, what are your picks?
Okay. To be honest, I don't have that much in the way of picks. So the real pick I have is that I was interviewed on another podcast. I was a guest on the Contagious Code podcast that Tejas, friend of our show, he's doing his own podcast thing. He's had some awesome guests like Guillermo Rauch and others. I highly, if you like tech podcasts, I mean, you're here, so you probably do. That's another one to look into. So I was a guest. We recorded actually a pretty lengthy one, about I think it was over an hour and a half, because we really got into my tech history and my tech journey, and things that I've done and how I got into the whole performance thing. And well, I've had a long career, as you can probably tell by looking at me, for those of you who are actually watching the video.
Beautiful, by the way.
Yes, I am, for sure. So that's one pick. The other pick is my new employer, Sisense. I've been there for about a week and a half. They've welcomed me wonderfully. I'm enjoying myself. Funny thing though, so I was getting into the code base and I thought, after just 3 days being there, and I thought, what could be a better way than to do a small pull request on the code. So I started looking at something to fix, ended up changing 20 files and what some people defined as core functionality of the product. But it got accepted, it got merged. So
if you're gonna go big.
Yeah, I did something right.
Whenever I try that, it always crashes the system.
So. But at the very least, you get noticed. And my final kind of an anti pick is that I watched the movie Atlas on Netflix, and the only good thing I can say about it is that it's more watchable than Rebel Moon.
What is Atlas about? I haven't heard of
it. It's a sci-fi movie with Jennifer Lopez. No, she's actually fine. It's the story that's kind of stupid, but and the action, the final boss fight is not much of a fight, in my opinion, and so it's kind of meh. Which, like I said, meh is much better than Rebel Moon. I could not finish watching the first one. So obviously, I didn't even try watching the second one.
All right.
Yeah. Anyway, those are my picks.
Good deal. I'm going to throw out a board game pick here real quick. Of course, I should have thought ahead and thought what I want to pick. I think I'm going to do another Legendary expansion. So one of the ones that I've really enjoyed playing is the Shield expansion. And I think a lot of it was based around, if you watch The Legend of Shield, or not The Legend of Shield, anyway, it was a TV show. That was the Agents of Shield TV show.
Oh yeah, there was such a thing.
Yeah, it pulled in a lot of stuff there. One of the optional things that you can do is you can buy a shield agent as part of your, one of your actions if you have enough to recruit them. And this one gives you basically you have special characters, and they're the characters from the TV show. But anyway, it's a fun expansion to play with. Nick Fury is in the main set of heroes that you can play with from the main game. And so I'm trying to find it on Board Game Geek. Give me a second here. Oh, here we go. So board game weight on this one is 2.75. I think the base game's like 2.35. So, it makes it a little more complicated, but it's not terribly complicated, and it's a fun expansion to play with. And so, anyway, I'm going to pick that. And then I have a couple of other picks. One of them is sitting on my desk. My 8-year-old made me a card. And so it says, "I love you, Dad." And anyway, I walked in this morning, it was sitting on my desk. So
don't you just love it when they're still young and do things like that for you?
Right. My 17-year-old's like, "What? You want something?" Right. So drive me to work. So anyway, but yeah, so that makes me smile for sure. And then, I've been pretty involved in the political scene here in Utah, and I just want to encourage folks, if you're out there and you care about what's going on in your society, I'm getting ready to launch a podcast about this stuff, but I really feel like a lot of the things that make the difference in the long term are what you're doing at home and then what you're doing in local politics. A lot of the folks that are running for Congress or Senate here in Utah or governor, they all kind of came out of local politics and then, kind of moved up a level and then another level, right? And so if you're not happy with your politicians, a lot of these folks kind of start at a smaller level and move their way up. And so you've got to support the right people at the local level, because many of them will wind up being your people at the higher or more broad levels, I guess. Or I don't want to say higher levels, because in a lot of ways, the further away from you they are, the less impact they have. It depends on the issue, obviously, but you see the dysfunction at the federal level here in the US, right? And you're just like, these knuckleheads that wind up in Congress, and some of them are really good and some of them are really not, and they came up the same way, right? And so go support your local folks that believe what you believe and value the things you value.
I do have a comment about this, if I may.
Yeah.
First of all, I totally agree with everything you said, and I think being involved and doing things for causes that are important to you is definitely a good thing. But there is a certain responsibility, I would say, that goes with it. That you do need to kind of do a bit of research.
Yes,
and do some thinking and some analysis and verify that the causes that you support are actually, correct and proper and righteous causes, and that you're not just buying into some demagoguery because it seems cool or it's the thing du jour or whatever. Mm-hmm. That you actually that you properly make up your mind and not just go based on right. What somebody has said. That's make it whichever way you think is best, and according to your own principles, but do the thinking, do the research.
I absolutely agree. Here in Utah, we have a caucus convention system, and so you have the local caucuses, you elect delegates, the delegates go and do a lot of that kind of a thing. But that doesn't mean that you can't be involved if you're not a delegate. But yeah, you should be doing the same kinds of research and having the same kinds of conversation with these folks as the delegates, and being okay, this is an issue. Where are you on it? This is a principle that I hold to. How do you feel about it? And then talk to other people and, inform yourself. Okay, they said this thing. Now, does it actually bear out in the way that they voted or, done their job as a representative in your local government? But yeah, I entirely agree. And, you know, the longer you do it, the more you, I guess, get better at sniffing out who really is where you want to be and where not. But there are also terrific organizations, and it's the same kind of thing where, as Dan said, you know, sometimes you get somebody that's, you know, the person at the top of the organization. It turns out that they were on an ego trip, right? And so they got a bunch of people that believe like you believe to back them up. And then it turns out that there's some issue, you know, there's something rotten at the core of it. And it's not because your principles were wrong. It was because you backed the wrong person, or because, you know, there was no way of knowing that this person was a problem. And so, yeah, you definitely have to do your homework, because you want to get in and push where it's going to make a difference, and make sure that you're backing these things. And I don't bat 1,000 on this stuff, right? I don't always get it right. But, you know, more often than not these days, I'm able to figure out, oh, you know, there's something here that's making me uncomfortable. And sometimes it's just a gut feel. And so I'll put my effort elsewhere, because yeah. And then it turns out that a lot of times that gut feel is right. Anyway, I'm starting a podcast to this effect. It's probably going to be focused mostly on the US. That doesn't mean that it can't apply to other countries, but it's going to be called America's Destiny. And it's essentially, it's this idea. It's like, okay, well, you know, as these issues come up, how do you address them at home? You know, with your kids, and then how do you address them with your neighbors? And then, you know, how do you get involved and understand how these things are going to affect you at the local level? And then how do you kind of find and reason through, okay, this is a good person to support at the local level. And then how do I encourage them when the right time comes along to go and make a larger impact in a, you know, in a different arena? So anyway, and I get myself in trouble sometimes for speaking up, but that's the way that goes sometimes. So anyway, those are my picks. Jack, what are your picks?
Yeah, I'll throw in a couple quickly. To briefly pull us back to the performance panel, we shipped something in Chrome recently called Selector Stats, which for Recalculate Stars event lets you dive into where that time was spent and the CSS selectors causing it. The reason I want to shout this out is because we didn't build it. It was built by the Microsoft folks who work on the Edge DevTools team, but they upstreamed it into Chromium. And so now it's available to Chrome and Edge users, which I think is just really nice that, you know, two big companies are able to collaborate and both share kind of features. So I thought that was really nice. I'll follow the board game theme as well. A latest addition to our board game collection is a co-op game called Sky Team, which is, I think, fairly new. I think I found it via a YouTube channel that does board game reviews. It's a cooperative 2-player game where you're piloting a plane and you have to roll dice and make strategical decisions to land the plane successfully. But what's really quite cool about it is once you've rolled these dice, which you then have to use in certain slots on the board to achieve things, you and your person you're collaborating with, you're not allowed to talk to each other, and the dice are hidden. So you've rolled 4 dice with certain numbers. Your other player has rolled 4 dice and have got 4 numbers. And in silence, you have to decide one at a time where to put these dice to achieve things. But, you know, it's classic. If you put 2 dice here that sum up to a number greater than 10, that's bad. But if you put 2 dice here that sum up less than 3, that's also bad. So it's kind of fun collaborating, but also with a bit of silence. It's enjoyable, and normally ends up with you looking at each other aghast with horror as your partner puts the wrong dice in the wrong box, which you never would have done. So that's been fun. So yeah, it's called Sky Team.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of some of the other sort of blind collaboration games like Hanabi, which is where you have your cards facing out so everybody else can see what cards you have, but you're the one that has to play them. And so you're giving hints, you know, you have some means of communication, but not a ton. So I just looked it up on Board Game Geek. It has a weight of 2.02, and I keep telling people that's kind of your average casual gamer that with a game that has enough complexity to make it fun and interesting. It says it runs in about 15 minutes. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think it's the first one took a bit longer as we figured it out,
Right,
but yeah, it's pretty snappy, which we have a new child in the house. So 15-20 minutes is about the max time we get to play a game. So yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, and then it's rated for kids age 12 plus. The community says that 10 plus can play it. So, you know, this is something that maybe I coach my 8-year-old on a little bit, but my other kids could probably play fine. Cool. I'm very into board games. I really enjoy them. So thanks for that. I'll check it out.
No worries.
All right, Jack, if people want to find you on the internet, where do they find you?
So Twitter is Jack_Franklin. Other than that, it's jackfranklin.co.uk for links to various other websites and blog posts and all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. All right. Well,
Thanks
we're
so
wrap
much
it
for
up
having me.
here. Yeah, thanks for coming. Till next time, folks, Max out.
Adios.
Thank you.
Hang on for a second.
This was a